Daniel is a plant ecologist who's been researching the tidal marsh plant communities of the Fraser River estuary for the past 6 years, completing tasks such as rare plant surveys, invasive species monitoring, rare species reintroductions, and compensation assessments, among other things. In 2015, he completed his Bachelor of Science in Ecological Restoration at BCIT, and he's currently a master's student at the University of BC in the Martin Conservation Decisions Lab. And you can see his title for the presentation, Undetected Yet Widespread, the Cryptic Invasion of Hybrid Cattail in the Fraser River Estuary. It's my great pleasure to introduce Daniel. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Today I'll be sharing a little bit of my master's research, which also happens to be a major passion, if not, it's bordering on obsession of mine. And I want to preface all of this by saying that the closing slide will have all my contact details like you see here. So feel free to contact me at a later time if you have any unanswered questions at the end of this. So in terms of where we're heading today, we'll briefly discuss the different cattails of BC. I'll then share with you the backstory of what led to the research I'm doing today and discuss my research and some of my preliminary findings. Then some of the take-home lessons that I believe I can offer so far from these findings, and then hopefully some time for a Q&A at the end. So let's talk about the cattails of BC. There are currently 3 cattail species listed in the flora of BC. So in the lower left, or in the left, is our lone native cattail, Typha latifolia or broadleaf cattail. And in many parts of the province, this is the only cattail present. Here in southwest BC, it still represents the vast majority of cattail we see each day along roadsides, railways, in wetlands. But we also have 2 other non-native species. So at the center here, we have narrow-leafed cattail, or Typha angustifolia. And this is a species that at one time it was debated whether it was native to North America or not, but now it's considered endemic to Europe, Asia, and North Africa alone. And we also have hybrid cattail, which is the hybrid offspring of latifolia and angustifolia. And here in North America, this hybrid regularly occurs in habitats where both species are present. So how do you tell these cattail apart? I have no desire to overwhelm you with a key in this presentation, so don't panic. We'll be sending out a PDF later. But to definitively ID these plants, particularly the hybrid, because its traits can be so intermediate, microscopic measurements are often necessary, even a molecular analysis. However, I will say keys like these have often proven to be pretty accurate, and I do have a lot of confidence in them. One of the take-home things I would pay attention to if you're looking at cattail is the flowers. And if you see a distinct gap between the female flower, which is that brown prominent flower we all see, and the male flower, which is more ephemeral, that usually is a strong indicator that it's at least a non-native lineage. Whereas our native one, they usually are tight together like that. This is just an example of looking at the pollen of cattail, and pollen can be a really useful way of IDing them. So this is from our native cattail, and it has these really unique tetrads. So in terms of the status of these species in BC, our first herbarium record of Typha angustifolia is from the Kootenays in the 1940s. And all other occurrence data, whether it be digital, so eFlora or other digital formats, as well as herbarium vouchers, are quite rare, and nearly all of them are post-1990. In terms of where it is in BC, it's known in southwest BC, so that includes Vancouver Island and the Gulf Islands, as well as the Lower Mainland, also the Kootenays and Southern Interior. And an interesting little tidbit is I have found records of it being sold in nurseries quite recent to now. The hybrid cattail, we only have one confirmed herbarium voucher at this time. And again, it's from the Kootenays, this time in the late 70s. But we also have a bunch of suspicious specimens called Typha latiforma, forma ambigua, from the Fraser in the 1970s, also from a few other areas. And I suspect they're the hybrid. And it is considered present, and it is being actively managed over in Rithets Bog in Saanich. And I think a few of those folks are listening in right now, and I don't know if it's been confirmed genetically and other things, but I think it is assumed to be there. And also in Washington State, their herbarium have vouchers collected from Puget Sound. So the question of whether this hybrid can exist in this climate appears to be, yes, it can. So the backstory of my research, in 2014, I was at this wetland creation workshop, and this expert from Kentucky handed out this form almost flippantly, like he didn't know that we had these cattail here. But this is what first made me aware of even the fact there were non-native cattail in North America. And then a year later, I got a big contract, and my colleague and I were in charge of assessing compensation sites all over the Fraser estuary. And it really didn't take a lot of time for us to encounter cattail at a number of these sites, several of which were totally overrun by these cattail. It was so alarming to us that we included non-native cattail in the discussion of our technical report. And we were just shocked at, there seemed to be almost no awareness of it in this region. And in subsequent years, as I've worked more and more in the estuary, I just continued to encounter it more and more. So there are now a lot more dots on this map. And naturally, this kind of began the rabbit hole of research that led to the master's work I'm doing today. So the following sequence of maps are basically a meta collection of herbarium records from all over North America. And you shouldn't see these dots on the map as being comprehensive of the true distribution of these species, but it does offer some insight into their spread. So the first record we have of angustifolia is over on the East Coast in 1827, and it may have been here much earlier, but that's our first record. By 1880, you'll see there's now a record in the Great Lake region. By 1900, you now have the red dots of the hybrid being collected. And by 1920, you'll notice a few dots over in California there. 1940, a lot more in the center of the continent. And you'll notice that as time goes on, these dots are encroaching on where we are today. And by 2020, they're essentially knocking at our door. So some of you might be wondering, well, what's the big deal here? What's going on with this cattail? Should we be worried? And with it being such a widespread species and it's been present for so long in our continent, there's fortunately an abundance of research where people have asked this question. And in my mind, the overwhelming evidence is that we should indeed be wary of these species. And the first reason for this is heterosis, or hybrid vigor. For those not familiar with that, it essentially means that the offspring of two parents is more robust than its parents due to the mixing of parental genes. So this is a story we've seen with invasives all over the planet, including Spartina anglica. And in this instance, hybrid cattail is known to be more competitive than either parent. It's capable of displacing them over time with robust growth and high plasticity. And in some situations, it's even back-crossing with its parents, leading over time to the emergence of hybrid swarms, where no unique cattail genotypes exist, and they've now been homogenized into varying degrees of hybridization. So this obviously raises a lot of conservation issues at both the species level, but also plant community level as well. And this then segues into the second issue, and that is the displacement ability of these cattail. So the estuary is a totally unique environment, and for people that love plants, I think it's one of the most fascinating places to work. Because these estuarine plants are organized along these elevational gradients into unique environmental niches. And where a species lands on this gradient is a product of how tolerant it is to things like inundation and salinity, as well as how competitive it is in these unique conditions. So in light of this, one of the big questions I often receive is, well, why should we care Because isn't the cattail just competing with our native cattail? Is it not just kind of a genus level battle going on? And this is a totally valid question, but there's so much evidence out there showing that the non-native cattail and the cattail do not have perfectly aligned niches, that the non-natives are actually far more resilient to salinity as well as higher inundation. Plus that hybrid, that ultra aggressive hybrid with high plasticity, it's able to occupy a much wider niche than its parents. And so what we're seeing in the Fraser Estuary and what we're seeing elsewhere in the continent is that these cattail are, yes, they're replacing other cattails, but they're also replacing other plant communities. For an example, this is an image taken on the outermost limits of Lulu Island, facing the Salish Sea. So these are some of the most saline conditions in our tidal marshes. And here's a patch of Typha angustifolia right near the marsh edge, hundreds of meters from the backshore. And these are conditions that are far too saline for our native cattail. And this cattail patch is expanding clonally, so via rhizomes under the ground, from mid-elevation marsh conditions where it's happiest into low elevation marsh where very few other species can exist. So that clonal growth enables it to occupy environments that are even outside of its initial niche. And these data are from a site in the South Arm Marshes, which is a wildlife management area. And this is the elevation, and it's increasing along the x-axis. And this is the percent cover increasing on the y. And the blue circles are Lyngby sedge. And so you can see this is kind of the elevational range that we documented as that. And non-native cattail, or the red diamonds, this is the elevational range. So you can see there's quite a bit of overlap between the cattail and our iconic estuarine Lyngby sedge. And this is disturbing in and of itself, but what I probably find most troubling is the collection of colored dots you see down here, which each represent a native plant. And so the area of the marsh and the elevation of the marsh that is most biodiverse very much overlaps with where we're finding these cattail monocultures. And so I have personally seen the displacement of a number of sensitive, rare, at-risk plants due to these cattail monocultures, and these are just a few of them. The prettiest ones for a PowerPoint. So the last reason I think we should be concerned is that the impacts of these monocultures extend beyond the plant community level and into other trophic levels. So there's been plenty of research of this also in our continent, and there's a long list of things that these cattails have an adverse effect on. And as a result, many wetland managers are now actively managing these cattail in an effort to protect biodiversity. So at this site, the photo you see here is a wetland in Kansas where they found that waterfowl usage was plummeting due to this cattail. So they've now been actively managing it in order to enable its usage again. So what you see here is an invasion curve. I imagine many of you are familiar with this. And in summary, the idea of this curve is that the most effective and cost-effective responses to invasive species either occur at the prevention phase or soon after entry in this eradication phase. And that as time goes on, management strategies change, costs increase, and the likelihood of flat-out eradication diminish. It's kind of reminiscent of some of the COVID-19 data we see. And so it was my hope at the outset of my master's research that we would find that the cattail was somewhere around here in this early eradication phase, and that it would enable a swift response. And so in order to determine that, I have asked 3 research questions. And the first one is simply, well, what is the current distribution of these cattail in the Fraser Estuary? And I won't dabble in the details. We don't have time to do that. But in short, I used remote sensing to analyze some high-resolution imagery of the estuary. And I found the unique color signature of each dominant plant species. And I then used GIS to classify this imagery, which assigned each pixel in the imagery to the species it was most likely to match with. So I'll show you an example of that. This is a portion of the South Arm Marshes before the classification, and this is what the classified non-native cattail pixels look like. And after extensive field verification, this model has proven to have an accuracy of over 80%, so really encouraging. Now, it's encouraging in that way, but it's not encouraging when we see the results at the estuary scale. So before I proceed, I want to point out that the scale of this map is logarithmic. So the areas that are crimson red are substantially more dense than areas that are yellow or even orange. So really pay attention to the crimson red areas more than anything. And so what you can see here are that there are these hotspots over in the Point Grey, South Vancouver area, as well as the outer edge of Westham Island and the South Arm Marshes Wildlife Management Area. And one of the surprising things that has also come from the field verification part of this is that the hybrid is comprised about 90% of these detections. So the hybrid is clearly the more abundant of the two non-native cattails. To look at these data through a different lens, this is simply looking at patch size. So you can see there's a patch over in, again, the Musqueam Point Grey area that is enormous. And there are a number of large ones in the South Arm as well. So it's really hard to photograph these patches. I probably need a drone to do it properly, but these are some field shots of what these little monoculture patches look like. And the second question I'm now asking, and I'm in the thick of this right now, is what is the projected distribution of these cattail in the estuary? And this is a really important question to ask, because for all we know, this current distribution that I just showed you the maps of may represent their maximum potential. However, if there's still a lot of suitable or susceptible habitat remaining, that changes our perception of this invasion and how we respond to it. So to answer this, I'm building a species distribution model. And what you see here is just a conceptual model of what we're considering at this time. And what we're trying to identify with this is the susceptibility of the estuary, which could be defined really as the likelihood of being colonized, given the suitability of a site. So for that, it takes into account like proximity to nearest patch. That's a big driver of that. We're also looking at the suitability, and the suitability looks at the establishment and persistence of cattail. And for that, we're considering environmental conditions more. So things like disturbance regime, elevation, and proximity to nearest channel. There are a million environmental variables we could consider, but we are limited by the spatial data we have. And it does appear in literature that elevation really is the primary driver of species distributions in estuaries. So rather than show you a really rough and indiscernible output from my model, which is in progress, here's an example of a study done by my supervisor in Australia. And this is with an invasive species there. And you can see their model has two map outputs, and it predicts hotspot areas for both suitability and susceptibility. And this can prove really useful for managers as they try to use their limited resources wisely and with precision. So the last question is there a cost-effective management solution to non-native cattail? Again, this seemed really important because this will change our perception of the species, knowing whether it's manageable or not. So to answer this, I have partnered with Ducks Unlimited Canada to carry out a cattail eradication experiment in the South Arm Marshes. This 5-acre site was converted from an agricultural field to tidal marsh through excavation and dike breaching about a decade ago. And soon after, it was invaded by hybrid cattail, and it hasn't changed much since. So for our experiment, we've divided the site into 9 zones. And what we have is a two-cut treatment where we're cutting it once annually over 2 years in July. And then we have a 3-cut treatment where we have an additional treatment added in May of the second year. So we actually just did it this past, just a week ago. And you'll also notice we have these zones outside of the site. And this is because we were concerned that the artificial conditions of this restoration site may render their results useless in their application to the greater estuary. So we just wanted to check to see whether cattail responded the same way in natural marsh. So I'll see if this video works. I don't think it's going to work. This was supposed to be, oh, there it goes. This is a time lapse of us cutting it. So basically, this took about 158 labor hours over 5 days last July. And we're trying to diligently track our labor hours because this will help us to evaluate cost effectiveness of different methods. It was a very hot day. So you will notice in the after photo here that we left leaf litter in situ. And there's lots of evidence in literature that cattail litter is actually a mechanism that it uses to suppress native vegetation. So we wanted to investigate the role of leaf litter in the management of cattail as well as in the restoration of this site. So we've created these paired plots that you see here, where half of them are fenced, half of them are not. And the fencing is excluding litter. So we removed the litter and the fencing keeps it from returning. And we're looking forward to monitoring their results this growing season. So I just want to end by touching on what can we learn from this invasion. The first thing is I think we need to recognize our bias towards non-cryptic species. So what do I mean by cryptic species? Well, cryptic invasions can be either the introduction and spread of non-native lineages within a native species range. I believe reed canary grass is an example of this, or the invasion of non-native species that simply goes unnoticed or undetected. So I believe that by default, our response to these cryptic invaders is likely to be slower and less effective than their eye-catching invasive counterparts. As an example, think of a meadow of purple loosestrife in full flower and how that just grabs your attention. However, a 1 acre monoculture of cattail is unlikely to do the same. Second, I think it also takes a lot more effort to convince managers and the public to care or respond to cryptic invaders, because we're dealing with those arguments like, isn't cattail a cattail, and things like that. So anything that we can do to be aware of and reduce this bias and sharpen our awareness of these cryptic invaders, I think will only do good for our ecosystems. The second lesson I want to touch on is I think we need to address some loopholes in our defenses. And I want to just say at the outset, this isn't targeting any agency or individual at all. This is intended to be constructive. But I do know that the BC government has evaluated over 300 plant species, which is great. And over 45 are now on our EDRR program, or maybe it is 45. And despite these impressive numbers, and despite the fact that both these cattail are known in our province and are known south of the border and are known to be invasives, they somehow slipped through any evaluation process to date. And so I think it raises the question then of where is the loophole? How did this happen? And I've given this some thought, and the only explanation I've come up with to date is that hybridization potential is still a loophole. So Typha angustifolia, this non-native parent to the hybrid, one could argue that as a standalone species, it actually isn't high risk. It's maybe just kind of weedy and successful in its establishment, but it's not ecosystem altering. However, by it being present, it facilitated the emergence of this vigorous hybrid in our region. And so one of the questions I ask is just, do our risk assessment ask questions like this that address potential hybridization in a species? And I'm happy to be wrong. I hope I'm wrong, but so far I haven't really encountered any mention of this. So the third lesson is I think we need to understand the susceptibility of estuaries to invasions, particularly urban estuaries. So one of the surprising findings of the study has been to find some of our most invaded areas are actually some of our most pristine habitats and some of our protected areas. But this shouldn't be surprising, because the Fraser Estuary is in close proximity to an urban area. It's at the foot of an enormous watershed that delivers seeds and plant fragments downriver, and it's regularly disturbed by natural and human-caused events. So I believe one of the lessons learned here is that passively managing our tidal marshes, whether they be protected areas, compensation sites, or just remnant marshes here and there, is not an option if we want to maintain their integrity. That we need to improve our monitoring and our diligence in these areas. So to finish, non-native cattail are established in the Fraser. They are capable of displacing native plant communities and their fauna. Their expansion potential is still uncertain, and management actions are being tested. I believe their cryptic nature inhibited our response to them, and our defenses should adapt to prevent similar narratives from occurring. So that's the end of my presentation, and I think we have some time for some Q&A, which I think you're going to handle, right, Tasha?
Yes, yep, we've got time for questions. I don't see any questions in the chat yet, but if you've got a couple things to ask, go ahead and pop them in there. And in the follow-up email, I'll also include Daniel's email address and the cattail key that he mentioned at the PDF. So we've got some thank yous here. Thanks for taking the time to be with us today. I have a question from Madeline. Were the native and invasive cattail different in spectral signature?
Yeah, that's a good question. So at the outset, I was actually thinking that each of those three cattail would have unique signatures. But what I found was that the two non-natives were most similar, and I probably attribute that more to the density at which they grow, because they grow at greater densities than our native cattail. So things like shadows and all that were at work. And so they did differ from our native cattail significantly. There were a few instances where the native cattail got confused, and those instances were when the native cattail was growing really dense. But generally speaking, in the estuary, you don't see a lot of ultra dense patches of our native cattail. It's more sporadic.
Great. I have another question from Melanie. Which areas along the estuary do you think should have the highest priority for monitoring?
Ooh, that's a very good question that I haven't given enough thought to. I mean, that's part of what I'm hoping my model will show, is what habitats are most suitable and susceptible to further invasion. And my plan is to then overlay that with our protected areas and see, are there protected areas that are, at risk of further invasion? So I would generally say I don't have an answer to that yet. Yeah, in terms of prioritization, I haven't quite got there yet.
Okay. Chloe asks, are there any preliminary results from last year's clipping?
Are there any preliminary results? Well, we haven't collected any data yet this year. We have done some cuts. The one thing I would say, and this is just anecdotal, is that I talked about, we had those marshes outside of Frenchies as well that are in the natural marsh. And so those areas are far more flushed than inside that restoration site. And so most of the litter there just got swept away over time or degraded. And what we ended up seeing then is that there was a lot more bare exposed mud in early spring. And so the regrowth of cattail started a lot earlier in those sites. Whereas the areas where the leaf litter just continues to sit, particularly inside that restoration site, the regrowth of cattail is very little at this point. But I expect that more to be a slowing than an actual stopping of cattail growth, if that makes sense. So I think our early observation is that litter, the presence of litter does impact how early cattail can emerge and start its dominance.
All right, we have time for one more question, but we are capturing the other questions that are coming in. And
Okay.
Sorry to put you to work again, Dan, but maybe we could send those questions to you. And then before we send the email out, you could just provide a quick response that we can send to everybody for the questions that we don't get to.
Sure.
The last question from Bev, it's about marsh-associated birds. I'm thinking about marsh wrens. Are the stems of the invasive cattail as strong as the native, and do they emerge at the same time? So are they as good for marsh wrens to attach their nests to?
Yeah, that was a question. We were concerned when we first began our treatments. We actually weren't allowed to do any cutting until July, end of July, because of the bird nesting window. And we weren't even sure at that time whether birds were nesting in them, but I can definitely say with confidence I have seen marsh wren and red-winged blackbird nesting in them, and they're certainly tall enough and robust enough to support those birds. So those are an example of some species that have benefited from this invasion, I'm sure.
Great. Well, once again, I'd like to thank Dan for joining us today, and you can look forward to a bit more information from him and also the key within the next day or two. I just want to provide a really brief update on what's happening with invasive species management in the region. I understand some of you may have joined specifically to hear Dan's talk, but many of you also work with invasive species as, you know, kind of the larger part of your job. And so I just wanted to provide a bit of an update on what I've been seeing in the last couple of months since we've been dealing with the COVID-19 crisis. So vegetation management work that supports environmental monitoring and remediation is considered an essential service recognized by the provincial government. And so some of the responses that I've seen is that there's been a variation by jurisdiction. So it sort of, you know, depends who you are and where you work. Many projects and programs were going ahead, especially for high priority species or for projects that were already ongoing. There have been some spending freezes that will impact programs and staff positions, but I'm pleased that for the most part, work is definitely continuing. Stewardship work and volunteer events have largely been put on hold. I'm aware that a stewardship event is happening on Saturday in New West, and that may be one of the first events that has been coordinated since the COVID-19 pandemic, but I believe in the next couple of months there'll be more events like that that will be opening up with physical distancing measures and other protocols in place to keep everybody safe. So of course there haven't been any community events or large gatherings or sort of in-person training opportunities. A lot of that has shifted online. If anybody requires a pesticide applicator license or have staff that require it, it's still possible to obtain or to take the exam for the industrial vegetation noxious weed category. So it is considered one of the essential categories, and you can take that exam by arrangement. They don't offer the group exam settings anymore, but it is possible to get that. I want to cover a couple of emerging species or species of interest in the region, starting with Butterbur, which has many, many common names. You can see them on the screen there. Giant Butterbur, pestilence wort, fuki. It's actually an edible plant, and it's used for medicinal purposes around the world. And the photo on the top there was taken by somebody who works in Renfrew Ravine, where they have a large infestation. And the bottom photo, you can sort of see the scale with the trees there, but it's quite a large plant. The leaves are huge. They're like the size of an umbrella. And they spread by rhizomes and root fragments. But you can see just the sheer size of the plant make it really difficult to remove. And the suggested management is digging or hand pulling plants or roots. Chemical control is possible as well, but you can imagine established populations will require a lot of years of management. And just like many invaders, once we know about an infestation, suddenly we start seeing it in more places, and we definitely have a number of infestations in Metro Vancouver of Butterbur. Of course, I need to cover the giant Asian hornet. Maybe many of you have been seeing the broadcasts and the news articles about this species since last year. So it was confirmed in a nest in Nanaimo last summer, and also identified in White Rock and Blaine at the end of 2019. So these hornets only nest in the ground, and they are expected to be overwintering in the area. So people that live close to the United States border were sent out packages to alert them that the species might be in and around their homes. So it's definitely a species that we should be watching for in Metro Vancouver. It's a serious honeybee predator capable of destroying hives, and it can be confused with a lot of other different species, but what's noticeable about them is that they're quite large. They have large orange heads and black eyes, and anytime there's any media coverage, I always get lots of calls and photos, and every single photo that I've received with a suspected giant Asian hornet this year, fortunately, has been something else. Although, as I mentioned, there are a lot of several lookalike species, especially people that see large wasps or other kinds of insects. They often get worried that it's actually the giant Asian hornet. So if you do have a suspected case, we're asked to send reports. You can send them to me, or you can send them to the Invasive Species Council at BC, and they get passed along to our provincial apiculturist, who will confirm the identification. There's also a provincial fact sheet on the giant Asian hornet. I can send you a link to that as well, and it shows some photos of some of the lookalike species, which is helpful. Dame's rocket is not an emerging species in our region, but it's one that I hear about a lot, especially this time of year because it's flowering. So it's definitely a species of note, and people are often surprised to find out that it is invasive. So you can see the flowers there, they're often different shades of sort of pink to white, and suggested management techniques are hand pulling before the seeds are mature. It can also be helpful to dig or loosen the soil around the roots. I actually had a patch in my own yard that I was digging out on the weekend, and for a herbaceous plant, it actually got kind of woody and definitely needed a shovel to get in there. So removal should be undertaken for a couple of years. And even if you get out and pull this year, there's likely to be regrowth next year simply because of the seed bank. Trying to remove may actually increase disturbance, and growth might increase for next year. But over time, that seed bank will get depleted. The seeds are not very long-lived. Chemical control is also possible for this species. A couple of resources that I wanted to share if you are not already familiar with them. We have a new regional public brochure that highlights our worst invaders, help stop the spread of invasive plants. So that's available through the regional district. And if you work for a jurisdiction or an agency and would be interested in having your own branded brochure where you can put your logo and contact information on the back, that is possible. You can contact me for more information. A couple of helpful websites there. Our website, bcinvasives.ca, which is the ISCBC website, is really helpful, and also growgreenguide.ca. One of my favorite topics are regional best management guides. So there are now 15 of these guides available online. Just new as of this week, we have guides for wild chervil, reed canary grass, yellow flag iris, and purple loosestrife. And that link is quite lengthy, so I'm going to ask Isabel to pop that link into the chat if you want to have access to it right now, and we'll also include that link in the follow-up message. But these are really great technical documents for practitioners and other people who want specific information about how to best manage these species in Metro Vancouver. Few upcoming events, a lot of them we don't have dates for yet. We'll be doing, hopefully, additional lunchtime forums throughout the summer and into the fall. If you have any ideas for speakers or activities that we could do during the lunchtime forums, I would love to hear that. The ISCBC had been planning a research forum August 15th to 18th, 2020 this year in Kelowna. That's been postponed to next year. However, they are intending to offer a virtual half-day event in August. And so watch for more information about that. Our AGM was postponed from the spring to the fall, and so we'll be having sort of a larger online event sometime in September, October, so please watch the date for that. Also in the fall, we're planning another information session for invasive species, so specifically for contractors, contract holders, and other practitioners who deal with invasive species. And so that's, you can see the poster from our event last year. It was an all-day in-person event, and we're shifting to having that be an online training event that will be shorter in duration. So you can watch for more information about that. Ways that you can keep in touch with us, I encourage you to contact us after today for more information. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. If you're not already part of our regional e-news list, to find out about anything invasive species related in Metro Vancouver, news, events, jobs, those sorts of things, let me know and I'll make sure that you get added to that. And I'm really excited to present our new YouTube channel, and hopefully Isabel can pop the link into the chat as well. We'll include it in the email. But now that we've been shifting from doing in-person training, we've been working on a series of short videos on how to ID particular species and how to manage them. They're sort of a visual way of capturing some of the information in those best management guides. And we're hoping to release videos every 1 or 2 weeks. And if you have any ideas for species or topics that you'd like us to cover, please let us know. We hope that resource will be with us for a long time and will just be continually adding to the database.